Today we will talk about terrorism in world politics. Terrorism is one subset of political violence. Political violence refers to a situation associated with politics in some way, in which force is used as a means of inflicting harm on others. In the late 1980s, a research study by Schmid and Jonkman uncovered 109 scholarly definitions of terrorism. Arguably, the landscape of terrorism has become even more complex since then. Thus, like other scholars, we need to admit that no one definition of terrorism encapsulates the violent phenomenon of which we are interested. Terrorism is difficult to define because it is discussed synonymously with terror as a political strategy. It is both a state and non-state strategy, and it implies normative assumptions. Many political acts, such as gang violence, war, and guerrilla tactics, produce terror as an emotional response in a population. Thus, terrorism's main impact is not exclusive to it as a strategy. Definitions of terrorism, therefore, must distinguish what terrorism is not. For example, it is not the compact actions of guerrillas who engage in regular trained armed forces, although guerrillas may use terrorism as a strategy at times. Terrorism first appeared as a term in the 1790s during Jacobin rule, who were those who supported the French Revolution, and following the French Revolution. Later, in the 1800s, European anarchists owned the term as they fought against autocratic states. During the interwar period of the 1930s and into the 1940s, terrorism became associated with states, specifically with the Great Terror waged by totalitarian states such as the Soviet Union. In short, terrorism is a strategy used by and against the state. Finally, the adage that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist demonstrates the normative dimension of terrorism that makes the term so difficult to define. According to Schmid and Jonkman, the most common elements to appear in definitions of terrorism include acts of violent force that are political, provoke fear, and pose threats. The 13th most common element of definitions is that terrorism targets civilians and non-combatants. Admitting that demarcating what is terrorism is a scholarly puzzle, we can still define terrorism as political activity that relies on violence or credible threat of violence to achieve its ends. Thus, we can see terrorism running from state to non-state terrorism along a spectrum of terror, running from genocide and state terrorism to terrorism by subnational groups to acts by individual terrorists. Subnational groups may include ethno-nationalist, religious, or ideological terrorists. Further, there are connections between the violent actions of the state and subnational terrorists, for the terrorism of one often provokes terrorism of the other. There are many different types of terrorism, and we will now spend some time talking about the different types. State terrorism is defined as terrorism by states against internal and external opposition groups. An example would be the activities of the Argentine military government during the Argentina Dirty War. This table details the many different types of terrorism, the one you saw earlier. In this picture here, you see just a small fraction of those who were killed by the state or disappeared and never seen again during the Dirty War. State-sponsored terrorism is also called international terrorism and is when a government harbors terrorists within its borders or otherwise sponsors terrorism outside of its home country. An example of state-sponsored terrorism would be the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, which refers to Pan Am Flight 103, which exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. The attack is believed to have been sponsored by Libya. In addition, this is what George W. Bush talked about after September 11th, when he said that the U.S. would make no distinction between terrorists and those who harbored them. Domestic terrorism is practiced within a single country without state sponsorship. The terrorist is usually a national of the country targeted in the attack. An example of domestic terrorism would be the Oklahoma City bombing carried out by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols in 1995. Here is a picture of the federal building which was attacked during the bombing. It remained the most lethal terrorist attack on U.S. soil until September 11, 2001, when al-Qaeda hijacked U.S. planes and flew them into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A third plane headed also for D.C. crashed into rural Pennsylvania. The September 11th attack was transnational terrorism, which we'll get to in a little bit. Ethno-nationalist terrorism is terrorism with the objective of independence, autonomy, or the reunification of a splintered homeland. An example of ethno-national terrorism would be groups like ETA or the Irish Republican Army. ETA operates in the Basque regions of France and Spain and agitates for a Basque homeland. Religious terrorism is terrorism carried out by cults, sects, and offshoots of mainstream faiths, propelled by fundamentalist zealotry. The type of religious terrorism we hear of the most often is Islamic terrorism, although every religious tradition has some extremist terrorist elements associated with it. Ideological terrorism is terrorism that is designed to achieve political goals that are determined by some pattern of political beliefs or theories. This can be left or right-wing in orientation. An example of right-wing terrorism would be right-wing militia movements in the United States. Timothy McVeigh held similar beliefs. An example of left-wing terrorism would be the Shining Path in Peru. Individual terrorism is carried out by one person who individually commits acts of violence. It is important to keep in mind that these terrorist attacks can be undertaken by men or women. Narco-terrorism is terrorism related to the drug trade. Nowadays, we often hear of narco-terrorism as associated with Mexico. Here we see the aftermath of a drug-related shootout. Finally, transnational terrorism is terrorism that operates at the transnational level, targeting transnational targets, or operates in more than one country. Al-Qaeda, translated as the base or the foundation, which we've talked about earlier, is the best known transnational network. It is also responsible for carrying out the September 11th attacks, the largest terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. It is important to keep in mind that these groupings that we've just talked about are not mutually exclusive. They are overlapping, and often a terrorist or terrorist group falls into multiple categories or multiple definitions of terrorism. Finally, counterterrorism refers to any efforts undertaken to combat or counteract terrorism. These can include military action, intelligence efforts, or even efforts to block web pages or bank accounts of suspected terrorists. Explanations of transnational or global terrorism and why it exists, particularly as it relates to Al-Qaeda, focus on three areas: culture, economics, and religion, as discussed in your book chapter, and I recommend that you go back and read this section. In particular, Al-Qaeda is thought by some to be a postmodern or a new terrorist organization, driven by ideas and not economic concerns. Terrorists use many different types of methods to carry out their missions. Armed attack is the most common tactic used, followed by bombing. Suicide bombing, where a terrorist blows him or herself up, together with a target, is used in about 10% of all attacks. Terrorist motivations vary depending on the type of terrorism we're talking about. If it's a state carrying out the attack, as we saw in the Argentine Dirty War, motivation is to get rid of people perceived to be state enemies. If instead it's ethno-nationalist, like ETA or the IRA, motivation is focused on getting a homeland. Ideological terrorism has ideological motivations, religious terrorism, religious motivations. Regardless of the motivations and the tactic of terrorism used, we see that overall worldwide deaths from terrorism have been down since 2007. This is due in large part to a decrease in violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.